Sometimes the land holds secrets we were never meant to find, and sometimes a man's curiosity costs him more than he can ever repay. High in the Colorado Territory stood a twisted tree growing straight out of solid rock. Folks called it the widow's tree and said no man who touched it came back the same. Mountain man Silas Boone didn't put much stock in old warnings. When he bought his homestead for $10 and a rifle, that strange tree caught his attention. One morning he heard something hollow beneath the stone. He swung his pickaxe and cracked it open. What spilled out brought the whole territory running, preachers, prospectors, and outlaws, all wanting a piece. But what Silas found was darker than gold or treasure. What had the mountain kept hidden all these years? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe. Tomorrow brings something special. The high country of Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1878 was a place where a man could still disappear if he wanted to. Silas Boone had counted on that when he rode into Redemption Springs with everything he owned, tied to a tired mule, and a promise to himself that he was done with the kind of life that left scars on the soul. He was 57 years old, though the mountains had weathered him until he looked closer to 70. His beard was streaked with gray, his hands were gnarled as old pine roots, and his eyes carried the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen more death than any person ought to. But those eyes still held something, a flicker of hope maybe, or just stubborn determination that there had to be more to living than surviving. The homestead he'd bought sat in a valley where the aspens turned gold in September, and the snow came early and stayed late. It wasn't much. A log cabin with a sagging roof, a barn that leaned like a drunk against the wind, and 40 acres of rocky soil that would fight him for every potato and turnip. But it was his, purchased fair and square from a widow named Hutchins, whose husband had frozen to death the previous winter trying to check his traps in a blizzard. $10 and a Winchester rifle. That's what it cost him. The widow had looked at him with tired eyes and said she was going back east to live with her sister, that the mountains had taken enough from her. Silas understood that. The mountains took and took until there was nothing left but bones and memories. The settlement of Redemption Springs wasn't much more than a wide spot in the trail, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a blacksmith's forge, and a two-room structure that served as both the deputy's office and the closest thing to law this part of the territory had. Maybe 40 souls called it home, scattered across the surrounding valleys in homesteads and claims that clung to the mountainside like lichen to stone. Silas had been living on his new property for 3 weeks when Martha Caldwell first came calling. She ran the general store with the kind of efficiency that came from years of managing resources, where everything had to be hauled in by wagon over roads that disappeared in winter. She was a handsome woman, in her middle years, with silver threading through her dark hair and a directness in her manner that Silas appreciated. She'd brought him a basket of supplies, flour, salt, coffee, a jar of preserves, and refused his immediate offer of payment. "Welcome to the valley," she'd said, standing on his porch, while the wind played with the hem of her practical dress. "We look after each other up here. Winter's hard enough without starting it alone." Silas had nodded, invited her in for coffee, and they'd sat at his rough-hewn table, making the kind of careful conversation that strangers make when they're trying to measure each other's character. She told him about the settlement, about the people he'd meet, about the rhythms of life in a place where the nearest real town was a 3-day ride. "Your land's got good timber," she'd said, looking out his window at the pine and aspen that crowded close to the cabin. "And there's a spring-fed creek that runs year-round. The Hutchins never did much with it, but a man willing to work could make something here." Then her eyes had settled on the strange tree that grew from the great slab of stone behind his barn, and something changed in her expression. "Though I'd advise you to leave that old tree be. It's been there longer than anyone can remember, and it's got a history that's best left undisturbed." Silas had looked at the tree, gnarled and twisted, its trunk thick as a wagon wheel, its branches reaching skyward like arthritic fingers. It shouldn't have been able to grow there at all, rooted as it was in solid stone. Yet there it stood, ancient and immovable, as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. "What kind of history?" he'd asked. Martha had set down her coffee cup carefully. "The kind that gets men killed. The Ute people who used to hunt these valleys wouldn't camp within sight of it. They said it was a place where the spirits were angry. The Spanish who came through 200 years ago called it El Árbol de la Viuda, the widow's tree. Nobody knows why exactly, but the name stuck. And over the years, men who've taken an interest in that tree have met with misfortune. James Hutchins, the man you bought this place from, he talked about cutting it down for firewood. Found him frozen to death a week later. Silas had studied the tree through his window, trying to see what made it different from any other old growth. Could be coincidence. Could be, Martha had agreed. But up here, we've learned that some things are best left alone. The land has its own ways, and fighting them only brings grief. After she'd left, Silas had walked out to examine the tree more closely. The stone it grew from was a single massive slab of granite, easily 30 feet across and rising from the earth like the back of some ancient beast. The tree's roots had somehow found purchase in hairline cracks, wedging themselves into the stone over decades or centuries, splitting it gradually the way ice splits rock in winter. He'd placed his hand on the rough bark and felt nothing unusual, just wood and sap and the faint vibration of wind moving through the branches. Whatever spirits or curses people wanted to believe in, Silas had seen enough real evil in his lifetime to know that men were usually more dangerous than ghosts. Still, he'd made a mental note to leave it alone. He had work enough without adding superstition to his list of problems. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that Silas found almost healing. He rose with the sun, worked until his muscles ached, ate simple meals, and slept the deep sleep of exhaustion. He repaired the cabin's roof, reinforced the barn, cut firewood until he had enough to see him through 2 winters. He met his neighbors, hard people with kind hearts for the most part, the kind who understood that survival up here meant cooperation. Reverend Solomon Pike came by on a Sunday afternoon, a tall man with a prophet's bearing and eyes that seemed to look straight through to a person's soul. He invited Silas to services, spoke briefly about the community of faith, and didn't press when Silas politely declined. But before he left, Pike had looked at the widow's tree and said something that stuck with Silas. "That tree's older than this settlement, older than the Spanish, maybe older than the Ute. Sometimes I wonder what it's seen, what it knows. The Bible speaks of trees that witness the deeds of men. The tree of knowledge, the tree of life. Maybe that one out there is a witness too. And maybe some testimonies are meant to stay silent." Deputy Ben Lockhart was younger, maybe 35, with a lawman's careful manner and the look of someone who'd seen enough trouble to respect it. He stopped by to introduce himself, took note of Silas's military bearing and the way he kept his firearms clean and ready. "You served?" Lockhart had asked. "Long time ago. Scouting, mostly. Army needed men who could read the land and survive alone. Did my time and got out," Lockhart had nodded. "We don't get much trouble up here, but it's good to know there's another steady hand in the valley. Winter can make people desperate, and desperate people do foolish things." They'd shared a drink and parted as men who understood each other. Both had worn uniforms. Both had seen the elephant, as the old soldiers said. Both were trying to find peace in a world that didn't make it easy. At night, alone in his cabin with the fire crackling and the wind moaning through the pines, Silas sometimes thought about his wife. Sarah had died 5 years ago, fever taking her quick and mean, leaving him with nothing but memories and a grief that time had dulled but never erased. She'd wanted a home, a place to put down roots, children to raise in safety. He'd promised her all of that, and then the war came, and then the scouting jobs, and then it was too late. This homestead was for her in a way. The life he was building here, the peace he was seeking, it was the promise he'd failed to keep while she lived, and keeping it now felt like a way to honor her memory. The widow's tree stood visible from his window, silhouetted against the stars. Sometimes late at night when the wind was right, he thought he could hear something, a faint sound, almost like breathing, or like the mountain itself sighing in its sleep. But that was foolishness, the kind of thinking that came from too much solitude and too many memories. He'd made his promise to Martha Caldwell, to Reverend Pike, and to himself. He'd leave the tree alone. Some things, as they said, were best left undisturbed. But the land has a way of choosing for us sometimes, and curiosity, once planted, grows roots of its own. It was early October when Silas first heard the sound. He'd been up before dawn, the way he always was, building up the fire and putting coffee on to boil. The air had that sharp, crystal quality that comes just before the first real snow, and his breath made clouds in the cabin as he dressed and pulled on his boots. He'd planned to spend the day reinforcing the chicken coop he'd built. Winter was coming, and the predators would get bold when food got scarce. But as he stepped out onto his porch with his coffee steaming in the cold air, he heard it, a sound, low and resonant, coming from the direction of the widow's tree. At first, he thought it was the wind moving through the branches, or maybe the creaking of old wood. But as he stood there listening, he realized it was something else, a hollow, metallic echo, like someone had struck a bell deep underground. It came in irregular intervals, faint but distinct, and it seemed to be coming from beneath the great stone slab itself. Silas set down his coffee and walked toward the tree, frost crunching under his boots. The sun was just starting to paint the eastern peaks with light, and the valley was still deep in shadow. The tree stood dark against the brightening sky, its twisted branches motionless in the still air. He stopped at the edge of the stone slab and listened. There, the sound again, definitely coming from below. It was like an echo in a cavern, or the reverberation of metal on stone. He'd heard similar sounds in his scouting days, exploring caves and mine shafts. This was the sound of hollow space, of emptiness beneath solid ground. Silas walked slowly around the perimeter of the stone, studying it with new eyes. He'd looked at this rock 100 times over the past weeks, but he'd always been looking at the tree, not at what lay beneath it. Now, in the early morning light, he began to notice things he'd missed before. The stone wasn't a natural formation, or at least not entirely natural. Its edges were too regular, too deliberately shaped. And there, along the northern face, he could see what looked like chisel marks, worn smooth by time and weather, but still visible if you knew what to look for. Someone had worked this stone long ago. Someone had shaped it. He knelt down where the tree's roots disappeared into cracks in the granite. The cracks weren't random. They followed lines, straight lines, geometric patterns barely visible under centuries of weathering and growth. This stone had been cut, placed, fitted together like pieces of a puzzle. And the tree had been planted in it, or had grown through it, becoming part of whatever structure this had been. The sound came again, clearer now that he was close to the ground. Definitely metallic, definitely from below. Silas sat back on his heels, his mind working through possibilities. The Spanish had been through here 2 centuries ago. Everybody knew that. They'd been looking for gold, building missions, claiming land for the crown. Could this be part of some old Spanish structure? A marker of some kind? The Ute had been here long before the Spanish, and they built sacred sites, though usually not with worked stone like this. He thought about Martha's warning, about the tree's dark reputation. He thought about James Hutchins, frozen to death after talking about cutting it down. He thought about all the practical reasons he should walk away, go about his day, leave this mystery alone. But he'd been a scout for too long. His survival had always depended on understanding the land, on investigating the unusual, on knowing what lay hidden beneath the surface. And something about this sound, this hollow echo from the depths, had gotten under his skin like a splinter. He stood up and walked back to his cabin. From the barn, he retrieved his pickaxe and a pry bar, tools he'd been using to clear rocks from what would be his garden come spring. Heavy iron, well-balanced, capable of breaking stone. The sun was fully up now, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere down the valley he could hear a rooster crowing. The normal sounds of morning in the mountains, birds calling, wind stirring the pines, the distant rush of the creek. Everything peaceful and ordinary. Silas returned to the stone slab and began examining it more carefully, looking for the weakest point. The cracks where the tree roots had forced their way in, those would be the place to start. The stone had already been compromised there, split by decades of slow, patient growth. If there was a way in, that would be it. He positioned the pry bar in the widest crack and leaned his weight against it. The stone didn't budge. He tried again, using the pickaxe as a wedge, working the iron deeper into the split. Still nothing. Whatever lay beneath, it had been sealed away for a very long time. Silas stepped back and studied the problem. He'd broken through stone before, opened collapsed mine shafts, cleared rock slides. You didn't fight stone head-on. You found its weak points, its natural fracture lines, and you worked with them. The sound came again, as if in response to his efforts. Hollow, waiting. He raised the pickaxe and brought it down hard at the point where 3 cracks converged. The impact rang out across the valley like a gunshot, echoing off the mountain faces. A chunk of stone the size of his fist broke free. Behind it, darkness. Silas felt his heart quicken. There was definitely a void beneath. He swung again and again, each blow carefully placed, widening the opening. The tree's roots had created natural weak points, and once he'd started the process, the stone began to give way more easily. After 20 minutes of hard work, he'd opened a gap about a foot across. He set down the pickaxe and knelt beside the opening, breathing hard. The air that rose from below was cold and stale, the smell of earth and stone that hadn't seen daylight in generations. He retrieved a lamp from the cabin and returned to the opening. The lamp's light penetrated the darkness, revealing more. Rough stone walls, definitely man-made and something else. Something that caught the light and threw it back in warm, burnished tones. Metal, shaped metal. Not just ore or natural deposits, but worked metal, forged and formed. Silas's hands were shaking slightly as he positioned the pry bar once more. Whatever was down there, it had been hidden deliberately, sealed away and marked with a tree that had become part of the local mythology. And now he was about to bring it into the light. He thought one more time about walking away, about filling in the hole he'd made, going back to his coffee and his chickens and the simple life he'd come here to build. But even as he thought it, he knew he couldn't. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. Silas swung the pickaxe with everything he had. The impact rang out like thunder, the sound rolling across the valley and echoing off the distant peaks. The stone slab cracked, a deep fundamental crack that ran from the opening he'd made all the way to the tree's trunk. For a moment everything was silent. Then, with a grinding groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, a section of the stone slab shifted, tilted. A gap opened, 3 feet wide, running alongside the tree's main root. And from that gap impossibly came light, not sunlight. This light was golden, warm, coming from below. The light of metal reflecting lamplight, or the glow of something that had been sealed in darkness for so long that the sudden exposure to air made it luminous. Silas's breath caught in his throat. He moved to the edge of the gap and looked down. There, in a cavity perhaps 6 feet deep and lined with fitted stones, sat an iron chest. It was perhaps 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, bound with bands of what looked like brass or bronze, ornately worked with symbols and designs that even in the lamp's uncertain light appeared intricate and deliberate. The chest was covered in a fine layer of dust, but the metal beneath shone with the dull gleam of something that had been made to last for centuries. And beside the chest, arranged as carefully as if they'd been placed yesterday, were other things, smaller boxes, bundles wrapped in what looked like oiled leather, and something that made Silas's blood run cold, human bones, not scattered or jumbled but arranged, positioned, the skeleton of someone who had been laid to rest with ceremony and purpose. The hollow sound he'd heard had been the chest settling, perhaps, or air moving through the cavity. But as Silas stared down at what he'd uncovered, he understood with absolute certainty that this was something more than hidden treasure or buried loot. This was a tomb, a memorial, a sacred trust that someone long ago had died to protect. He should have left it alone. Even now, looking down at what he'd found, he knew he should cover it back up, seal the stone, walk away, and never speak of this. But he'd already crossed the line. The thunder of his pickaxe striking stone had carried across the valley. People would have heard it. Questions would be asked. And besides, he had to know, had to understand what this was, why it was here, what it meant. Silas lowered himself carefully into the cavity. The space was just large enough for him to crouch beside the chest. Up close, he could see that the symbols on the metal bands were Spanish, crosses and crowns and elaborate scrollwork that spoke of the old world, of empires and conquests and religious fervor. He reached out and touched the chest's lid. The metal was cold, almost painfully so, as if it held some deeper chill than the surrounding earth could account for. And there, set into the lid in silver inlay, were words in Spanish. His Spanish was rough, learned from traders and scouts, but he could make out enough. Sacramento del Montaña, it read. Que los fieles guarden, que los impíos teman. Sacrament of the mountain. Let the faithful guard it. Let the wicked fear it. Silas sat back on his heels, his mind racing. This wasn't treasure. This was something holy, something the Spanish had hidden here, marked with that impossible tree, and guarded with warnings and curses that had lasted for centuries. He looked up at the opening above him, at the bright morning sky beyond. The day had started so normally. Coffee and chickens and plans for winter. And now he was sitting in what amounted to a tomb, with a chest full of secrets and a skeleton for company, and he knew with absolute certainty that his life would never be simple again. The sound came one more time, not from the chest, but from far off. The sound of voices, people calling out. Someone had heard the thunder of breaking stone, and they were coming to investigate. Silas stood up quickly, his head barely clearing the opening. He could see figures in the distance, moving up the valley road toward his property. 3, maybe 4 people moving fast. He had minutes maybe before they arrived. Minutes to decide what to do, what to tell them, what to show them, what to keep hidden. His eyes fell on the chest again, on those silver words gleaming in the lamplight. Let the faithful guard it. Let the wicked fear it. Too late for guarding it now. The seal was broken. The secret was out. And Silas Boone, who had come to these mountains seeking peace and solitude, had just opened a door that would bring the whole territory running. Silas made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He climbed out of the cavity, grabbed the largest piece of broken stone he could manage, and dragged it over the opening. It wouldn't hide what he'd found, but it would at least give him a moment to think before curious eyes saw everything. The voices were closer now. He could make out Martha Caldwell's among them, calling his name. He walked away from the tree, meeting them halfway across his property, trying to look calm despite the sweat on his face and the rock dust covering his clothes. Martha arrived first, slightly out of breath, with young Thomas Fletcher and his father John behind her. Thomas was maybe 16, all gangly limbs and enthusiasm. John was a steady man who worked a claim 3 valleys over, someone Silas had met once at the general store. We heard... Martha stopped, taking in Silas's appearance. We heard what sounded like an explosion. Are you all right? I'm fine, Silas said, keeping his voice level. Just clearing some rock. Didn't realize it would carry so far. John Fletcher moved past them, looking toward the widow's tree. That sound came from over there. Near the tree, his eyes narrowed as he saw the disturbed earth, the chunks of broken stone scattered around the slab. What were you doing, Silas? Like I said, clearing rock. That slab was blocking drainage I need for spring planting. It was a weak lie, and they all knew it. Martha's eyes held his for a long moment, and he could see the questions there, the concern. She glanced at the tree, then back at him. Silas, what did you find? He could have kept lying. Should have, probably. But Martha had been kind to him, had welcomed him to the valley, and he'd never been good at deception. Something. Under the stone. I'm not sure what yet. Young Thomas's eyes went wide. Is it treasure, gold? People say the Spanish hid gold all through these mountains. Thomas, hush, his father said sharply. But John's eyes had the same glint now, the same quick calculation that comes when men start thinking about fortune instead of sense. Silas held up his hand. Whatever it is, it's on my property. And before word spreads, and we have every prospector and claim jumper in the territory camped on my land, I'd appreciate the chance to figure out what I'm dealing with. Martha nodded slowly.
That's fair.
But Silas, if you found something under the widow's tree, you need to understand this won't stay quiet. That tree's been part of valley legends for too long. People will talk. They'll come looking. I know, Silas said quietly. I know. John Fletcher cleared his throat. Well, it's your land, like you said, your find. But if you need help, if there's heavy lifting or digging to be done, I'd be willing to lend a hand. For a fair share, of course. I appreciate that. John, but for now I need to assess what's there before involving anyone else. They talked for a few more minutes, Silas deflecting questions as best he could, until finally the Fletchers headed back down the valley. Martha lingered, her expression troubled. The widow's tree has a dark history, she said quietly. Men have died because of it. They don't believe in curses, Silas, but I believe in greed, and I believe in the violence that comes when men want something bad enough. Whatever you found, be careful who you trust with it. I will. Thank you, Martha. She started to leave, then turned back. If you need help understanding what you found, if there's writing or documents or anything that needs translation, I can help with that. My late husband was a scholar before we came west. He taught me Spanish and some Latin. It's not widely known, but I'm offering. Silas felt a weight lift slightly. He'd been dreading trying to decipher whatever documents might be in that chest, struggling alone with a language he barely knew. I may take you up on that soon. After she left, Silas returned to the tree. He moved the stone covering and looked down at the chest again. He couldn't leave it there, not now. Word would spread. It probably already was spreading, and by nightfall he'd have visitors of a less friendly sort. He rigged a rope and pulley system using tackle from his barn and managed to hoist the chest out of the cavity. It was heavy, easily 100 pounds, but the metal had held up remarkably well. Whatever the Spanish had used to seal and protect it had done its job for more than a century. He dragged it into his cabin, barred the door and closed the shutters. Only then, by lamplight in the middle of the day, did he finally open it. The lid resisted at first, the hinges stiff with age, but they weren't rusted. Whoever had made this had known their craft. When the lid finally swung open, Silas found himself looking at a collection of objects that spoke of a world and a time far removed from his simple mountain cabin. On top, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow remained supple, were documents. Sheaves of paper covered in careful Spanish script, maps drawn with precise lines and notations, and what looked like a journal bound in leather. The paper was yellowed but intact, the ink still legible. Beneath the documents were smaller boxes. One contained religious medallions, silver and gold, bearing images of saints and crosses. Another held coins, Spanish pieces of 8, each one bearing the seal of the crown, not a fortune, but enough to attract attention. But it was the bottom layer that made Silas catch his breath. There, nestled in more oiled cloth, was a wooden case about the size of a book. The wood was dark, almost black, inlaid with silver wire in elaborate patterns. And when he carefully opened it, he found more documents, these ones on vellum rather than paper, and written in what looked like both Spanish and Latin. He couldn't read most of it, but certain words stood out. Sacramento, Sagrada, Martyr, Sacrament, Sacred, Martyr. This wasn't a treasure chest. It was a reliquary, a container for holy objects. And whatever those objects were, someone had thought them important enough to carry across an ocean, through hostile territory, and bury in a marked grave in the wilderness. Silas carefully removed one of the vellum documents and held it to the light. The writing was formal, official, with seals and signatures that suggested this was some kind of ecclesiastical document, a certificate or authorization from the church itself. He needed Martha's help. These documents would tell the story of what he'd found, and he needed to understand that story before he could decide what to do next. He gathered up the most important-looking papers, wrapped them carefully, and tucked them inside his coat. Then he secured the chest, hiding it under a loose floorboard beneath his bed. It wouldn't fool a determined search, but it would keep casual eyes from seeing what he'd found. The sun was setting as he made his way down the valley to the general store. The autumn air had turned cold, promising frost by morning. Smoke rose from chimneys, and he could see lamplight in windows. Normal life, continuing as it always had. But Silas knew that normal was ending. The chest in his cabin, the papers under his coat, they were like a lit fuse, and he had no idea how much time he had before the explosion. Martha was closing up the store when he arrived. She took one look at his face and nodded. "Come around back. We'll talk where there's privacy." Her living quarters behind the store were simple but comfortable. A sitting room with a good stove, shelves lined with books, and a table where she kept her accounts. She lit lamps and put coffee on, while Silas laid out the documents he'd brought. When she saw them, her eyes widened. She moved closer, her fingers hovering over the vellum, without quite touching it. "Silas, these are official church documents. Do you understand what that means? I was hoping you could tell me." She pulled up a chair and began to read, her lips moving silently as she worked through the archaic Spanish and Latin. Silas drank his coffee and watched the play of emotions across her face. Surprise, confusion, and finally something like awe. After nearly an hour, she sat back and looked at him. "This document is dated 1752. It's a papal authorization for an expedition to transport sacred relics from Mexico City to a new mission in the Northern Territories. The expedition was led by a Capitan Diego Morales with military escort and a Franciscan friar named Sebastian de Cordoba. Sacred relics," Silas repeated. "What kind of relics?" Martha shuffled through the papers, finding a particular passage. "It doesn't specify exactly, but it refers to the preserved remains of the blessed martyrs and items of devotion crucial to the establishment of the faith among the heathen peoples. But that could mean anything from saints' bones to religious artifacts, crosses, vestments, pieces of the true cross. The Spanish collected such things obsessively, and they buried them in my land? Why? That's where it gets interesting." She pulled out one of the maps. "This shows the intended route from Mexico City north through what's now Arizona and into Colorado. But look here." She pointed to a series of notations along the route. "These marks indicate attacks. The expedition was harassed repeatedly by indigenous warriors. And there are notes here about internal dissent, about disagreements between the military commander and the friar." Silas leaned forward, studying the map. "They never made it to their destination." "No. Or if they did, they didn't stay there. This journal," she held up the leather-bound book, "this appears to be the friar's personal account. I've only read a few entries, but it's clear the expedition was falling apart. Men were dying, trust was breaking down, and Capitan Morales was becoming obsessed with something." With what?" Martha's finger traced along a passage. "The friar writes about Morales demanding to know the exact value of the relics, whether they were decorated with gold or jewels. The friar refused to tell him, saying such questions betrayed the mission's sacred purpose. There was conflict, serious conflict." She looked up at Silas, and he could see the pieces falling into place in her mind just as they were in his. The expedition never reached its destination because something happened. And whatever happened, it ended with that chest buried under a stone marker and a tree planted as a seal. "The skeleton I saw in the cavity," Silas said quietly, "laid out proper, arranged with care. Someone was buried there deliberately." "As a guardian," Martha said. "That's what the phrase on the chest means. Let the faithful guard it." Someone chose to stay behind, to be buried with whatever they were protecting. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they'd uncovered settling over them. This wasn't just historical curiosity. This was a story of faith and greed, of sacred duty and betrayal, playing out in the wilderness more than a century ago. And now they were holding the evidence of it, the final testimony of men long dead. "What do we do with this?" Silas finally asked. Martha looked at the document spread across her table. "We need to read all of it. The friar's journal especially. If we're going to understand what you found, we need to know the whole story. And Silas, her eyes were serious, we need to be very careful about who else learns of this. If people find out there are Spanish relics involved, word will spread like wildfire. You'll have treasure hunters from Denver to Santa Fe camped on your land. I know. That's why I came to you. She nodded. Give me a few days with these documents. I'll translate everything I can. In the meantime, keep that chest hidden and don't tell anyone else what you found. Not even Deputy Lockhart. Not yet. Silas agreed, gathered up most of the documents to return them to his hiding place, and left Martha with the friar's journal and a few of the maps. As he walked back through the darkness toward his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that somewhere in the shadows eyes were following him, calculating, planning. The chest was still where he'd left it, undisturbed. He checked the locks on his door, loaded his rifle, and sat by the window watching the night. The widow's tree was a dark shape against the stars, its branches reaching upward like a warning or a prayer. Somewhere out there, word was spreading. The mountain man had broken the rock. He'd found something beneath the widow's tree, and people would come. Good people and bad, curious people and greedy people, people seeking truth and people seeking fortune. Silas had opened something he couldn't close. All he could do now was try to understand it, before the understanding was taken from him by force. 3 nights later, Martha sent word through young Thomas Fletcher. She'd finished translating the friar's journal and needed to see Silas right away. The urgency in the message made Silas check his rifle twice before heading down to the store after dark. He found Martha in her sitting room, the journal open on the table before her, her face pale in the lamplight. She'd been crying. He could see the tracks on her cheeks, and when she looked up at him, there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Fear, maybe, or sorrow for things long past. Sit down, she said quietly. You need to hear this. Silas sat, and Martha began to read from her translation. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the emotion beneath it, the weight of the words she was speaking. The journal begins on March 15th, 1752, when the expedition left Mexico City. Fray Sebastian de Cordoba was a Franciscan, 42 years old, who'd spent his life in service to the church. He'd been chosen personally by the bishop to accompany the expedition because he was known for his piety and his strength of character. The relics they were transporting, Martha paused, meeting Silas's eyes, were the preserved heart of San Felipe de Jesus, the first Mexican martyr, canonized in 1627, a relic of immense importance to the church in New Spain. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. Not treasure, not even religious artifacts in the general sense. They'd been carrying the actual physical remains of a saint. Martha continued reading. The expedition was 20 men, soldiers, a priest, guides, and porters. Capitan Diego Morales commanded the military escort. The friars' early entries are hopeful. They believe they're on a sacred mission, carrying a holy relic to establish a new mission among the tribes of the northern frontier. But within a month, things began to go wrong. She turned pages, reading excerpts. The journey north was harder than expected. The trails were rough, the weather unpredictable, and the indigenous peoples they encountered were hostile, having already had bad experiences with Spanish expeditions. Small attacks, harassing strikes, men wounded and killed. By June, Martha said, they'd lost 6 men, and Capitan Morales was changing. The friar writes about conversations he overheard, Morales talking to his lieutenants about the value of the reliquary itself. It was gold, you see, solid gold, decorated with precious stones. Worth a fortune on its own, never mind the religious significance of what it contained. The friar's concern grew with each entry. He began to suspect that Morales had never cared about the mission's religious purpose. The captain had volunteered for the expedition because he saw it as an opportunity for wealth. And as more men died and the journey grew harder, Morales became more open about his intentions. In July, they reached what's now Colorado, Martha said. The friar writes that the landscape reminded him of Calvary. Desolate, harsh, a place of suffering. They were down to 12 men. and Morales was talking openly about abandoning the mission, taking the reliquary, and heading east to sell it. The friar confronted Morales. There was an argument, witnessed by all the remaining men. The friar invoked his authority as a representative of the church, demanded that Morales honor his oath and complete the mission. Morales laughed at him. That night, Martha's voice dropped to almost a whisper, Morales murdered 3 men who'd sided with the friar, killed them in their sleep, and blamed it on indigenous raiders. The friar knew the truth but was powerless to act. He was one man, a priest, against armed soldiers who'd chosen greed over honor. Over the next weeks, the expedition fractured completely. Some men deserted, others died in genuine attacks. By the time they reached the valley that would one day hold Redemption Springs, only 5 remained: Morales, 2 loyal soldiers, a guide, and the friar. The friar writes that he knew he was going to die, Martha said. He'd seen it in Morales's eyes. The captain couldn't let him live to tell what had happened, but the friar also knew that he couldn't let Morales take the relic. It wasn't just gold and jewels to him. It was the heart of a martyr, a sacred trust given into his care. She turned to the final entries, and Silas could see her hands trembling slightly as she read. August 12th, 1752, I have made my decision. God forgive me if I choose wrongly, but I see no other path. Tonight, while the others sleep, I will take the reliquary and hide it. There is a place, a great stone outcrop near a spring. I will open the earth beneath it and seal the relic there, marking the spot with a tree from the sacred seeds I carry. Let this be my offering, my final act of service. If I am to die in this wilderness, let my death have meaning. Let me die as a guardian, as so many martyrs died before me. Martha's voice broke. She took a moment to compose herself before continuing. August 13th, it is done. I have buried the reliquary deep, sealed it with prayer and stone. Above it I have planted the seeds of the sacred fig, blessed by the Holy Father himself. They say such seeds can grow even in rock, that faith can make them flourish in impossible places. Let this tree be a sign, to the faithful a marker of holy ground, to the wicked a warning. August 14th, Morales knows I have taken the reliquary. He rages like a man possessed. He has tortured the guide to death, thinking I told him where it was hidden. Now only the 2 soldiers remain with him, and they grow fearful of their captain's madness. I have told Morales I will never reveal the location. He threatens me with death. I tell him I welcome it. What is death to a man who has already given his life for a purpose greater than himself? Martha looked up from the journal. That's the last dated entry. But there's one more page written in a different hand, shakier, as if the writer was injured or dying. She read the final words. I lie now in the place I prepared for myself, in the chamber beneath the stone. Morales found me this morning and beat me near death, demanding the location of the reliquary. I told him nothing. He has gone mad with rage and greed. He killed his own soldiers when they suggested abandoning the search. Now he wanders the valley alone, cursing God and me, promising he will find what I have hidden. I have perhaps hours left. I write this so that if someone should find these words, they will know the truth. The reliquary is safe, buried beyond Morales's reach. I have sealed it with my blood and my prayers. I have laid myself to rest beside it, so that even in death I might guard what was entrusted to me. The torture Fray Sebastian described was horrific, days of brutality designed to break his will and make him reveal the marker's locations. But the friar had held firm, drawing strength from prayer and from the belief that what he protected was more important than his own suffering. Morales has gone mad, Martha read from one of the final entries, her voice thick with emotion. He killed Garcia with his bare hands when the soldado tried to intervene. Ruiz he shot when the man cursed him for betraying his oath. I'm alone now with my tormentor, and I know I will not survive this encounter. But I have won a greater victory. I have not spoken. The 3 seals remain unknown to him. When he finally accepts that I will not break, he will leave me here to die, and I will drag myself to the tree I planted, the first seal, and there I will keep my eternal watch. My body will become part of the stone, and my soul will stand guard until the end of days. May God forgive me for the lives this quest has cost, and may he send only the pure of heart to seek what I have hidden." The lamp flickered, throwing shadows across the rough walls of the cabin. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the pines, with a sound like voices mourning the dead. "Only the pure of heart," Silas repeated. "And here I am, about as pure as mountain mud, planning to dig up everything he died to protect." Martha looked at him steadily. "Are you having second thoughts?" Was he? Silas examined his own motivations with the same honesty that had kept him alive through decades of danger. Why was he doing this? For treasure? For glory? For the simple human need to know? "I'm doing it because it's there," he said finally. "Because a story this old deserves to be finished. Because Fray Sebastian made his choice and died for it, and that has to mean something. Maybe I'm not pure of heart, but I'm not false either. I won't sell what I find to the highest bidder. I won't use it for personal gain, but I will see it through to the end." Martha nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied something in her. "Then you need to understand the last part of the journal, the part where he describes the second and third seals," she read on, and Silas took careful notes. "The second seal was in the high country, in a canyon that the maps showed perhaps 15 miles north of his homestead. The friar described it as a place where water carved through stone, creating natural chambers. He'd placed the ecclesiastical documents in a cavity behind a waterfall, sealed them in waxed leather to protect them from moisture. The third seal, the one containing the reliquary with the saint's heart, was the most remote. It lay in a cave system deep in the mountains, a place the friar had discovered by accident when fleeing from hostile natives. He described treacherous approaches, narrow passages, chambers that seemed carved by some force beyond nature. He'd placed the reliquary in what he called the cathedral chamber, a vast underground space where stone formations resembled the pillars and arches of a holy place. He performed a ritual, Martha read. "Listen to this. I have anointed the chamber with holy oil brought from Mexico City. I have said the prayers for consecration, transforming this natural space into sacred ground. The reliquary rests on a stone altar of God's own making, guarded by the mountain itself. I have marked the path with signs that only one versed in the faith will recognize, the stations of the cross, rendered in stone cairns and carved symbols. The profane will see only random marks. The faithful will see the way." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The friar had been thorough, had planned for every contingency. He'd created not just hiding places, but a pilgrimage, a journey that would test body and spirit both. "There's one more thing," Martha said, her finger tracing the final page of the journal. "His last words. He wrote them after Morales left him for dead, after he'd dragged himself to the tree. They're barely legible. His hand was failing." She read slowly. "To whoever finds this record, know that what you seek is sacred beyond measure. Know that men have died to protect it and will die again if it falls into profane hands. I ask you, I beg you, to examine your heart before you proceed. If you seek treasure, turn back now. If you seek glory, turn back now. But if you seek truth, if you seek to fulfill a sacred trust that has waited in darkness for its appointed time, then go forward with my blessing. And may God guide your steps where mine could go no further." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Martha closed the journal gently, as if it was something holy in itself, which in a way it was. It was the last testament of a man who'd sacrificed everything for his beliefs. "Tomorrow," Silas said quietly. "I'll leave at first light and head to the second marker. It's only a day's ride if the weather holds." "I'm coming with you," Martha said. Silas turned to look at her, surprised. "Martha, it could be dangerous. If there are men watching, if they follow, all the more reason for you not to go alone," she interrupted. "Besides, you need someone who can read the ecclesiastical documents if we find them. My Joseph taught me enough Latin and church terminology to manage." And she paused, then met his eyes directly. "I've been living in this settlement for 15 years, running a store, keeping accounts, being respectable. Maybe it's time I remembered what it feels like to be part of something larger than daily routine. Silas studied her, really looked at her for the first time since she'd come into his life. She was perhaps 50, still strong and capable, with an intelligence in her eyes that spoke of depths he hadn't fully appreciated. She'd been a scholar's wife, had probably lived a life of the mind before circumstance brought her to this remote settlement. Maybe she did need this as much as he did, for reasons he couldn't fully understand. "All right," he said, "but we do this carefully. We tell people you're coming to help me survey my property line. We leave separately and meet on the trail. And if there's trouble, real trouble, you get clear and let me handle it." She smiled slightly. "I've been taking care of myself in hard country for a long time, Silas Boone, but I appreciate the concern. We'll be careful." They finalized their plans, agreed on a meeting point, and reviewed the maps one final time. By the time Martha left to return to her quarters above the store, it was well past midnight. Silas walked her part way, his rifle over his shoulder, alert for any sign that they were being watched. The settlement was quiet, windows dark except for the saloon where a few late-night drinkers still gathered. But Silas couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in that darkness, eyes were tracking their movements. Deputy Lockhart had warned him about strangers asking questions. Those strangers were out there somewhere, planning their own approaches to the mystery that Silas had uncovered. Back in his cabin, he lay in his bedroll but didn't sleep. His mind kept circling back to the friar's final question: examine your heart before you proceed. What was in his heart? Greed, curiosity, a need to matter, to be part of something significant. Or maybe something simpler, a man near the end of his life, looking for one last purpose, one last mission that would give meaning to all the years of wandering and violence that had come before. He thought of Sarah, of the promise he'd made to build a home. Was this betraying that promise, or fulfilling it in a way he hadn't expected? She'd always said he needed something to believe in beyond mere survival. Maybe this was it. Maybe the friar's sacred trust could become his own. Outside, the widow's tree stood guard over its buried secrets. And somewhere in the high country, another marker waited, holding documents that would illuminate the next part of the mystery. Silas finally slept as dawn approached, and his dreams were filled with images of mountains and martyrs, of sacred hearts kept alive by faith across the centuries, of bones turning to stone in the darkness, and of a man himself climbing ever higher toward truths he could not yet imagine. The sun was barely clearing the eastern peaks when Silas saddled his horse and loaded his gear. He'd told no one his plans except Martha, but as he rode out of his property, he noticed fresh tracks in the soft earth near his fence line. Someone had been watching during the night, close enough to see his cabin, far enough to avoid detection. The knowledge settled like a stone in his gut. Deputy Lockhart's warning had been accurate. The treasure hunters had already arrived, drawn by rumors like wolves to the scent of blood. They'd be following him now, watching to see where he led them. He rode north slowly, taking a roundabout route that would let him spot anyone trailing him. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of autumn day when the air tastes like snow that hasn't fallen yet. Aspens blazed gold on the hillsides, and the high peaks wore fresh white caps from a storm that had passed through 2 nights before. He met Martha at the agreed-upon spot, a lightning-struck pine that stood like a sentinel 3 miles from the settlement. She arrived on a sturdy mare, dressed practically in riding clothes with her hair tied back under a hat. She'd brought supplies of her own, and more importantly, she'd brought Joseph's surveying equipment as cover for their excursion. "Anyone follow you?" Silas asked. "Not that I could see, but I'm not a scout. If someone was careful, I might have missed them." Silas nodded. "There's at least one person watching my place. Maybe more. We need to assume we're not alone out here." They rode together into the high country, following game trails and old mining tracks that led north into territory that grew increasingly remote. The friars' maps were remarkably accurate considering their age. Landmarks that Fray Sebastian had drawn in 1752, distinctive rock formations, creek crossings, peculiar tree growth, were still there. still recognizable, guiding them like signposts across the decades. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a cold meal. Silas pulled out the compass he'd found in the Spanish chest, the silver military compass with its inscription, Por la gloria de Dios y España. For the glory of God and Spain. He'd been using it to navigate, and it worked perfectly despite its age. But as he held it in the mountain sunlight, he found himself wondering about the men who'd carried it. Capitan Morales had owned this once, had trusted it to guide him through unknown territory. Had he been evil from the start, or had the wilderness changed him? Had the weight of his responsibility, guarding something sacred, proven too heavy for his character to bear? "What are you thinking?" Martha asked, watching him study the compass. "About how men change," Silas said. "Or maybe how pressure reveals what was always there, hidden under the surface." Morales started out as a captain in the Spanish army, trusted with an important mission. He ended up a murderer and a thief. What happened in between? Greed happened, Martha said, and fear, and the corrosive belief that some things are more important than honor. The friar writes about it in the journal, how Morales began to see the relic not as a sacred trust, but as an opportunity. Once you start thinking that way, every other consideration becomes negotiable. Silas tucked the compass away and stood, stretching muscles that were protesting the long ride. "Then we'd better keep each other honest. If either of us starts sounding like Morales, the other has permission to knock some sense into them." Martha smiled. "Agreed." They rode on, climbing higher into country that few men visited, the valley that the friar had described, the place where water carved through stone revealed itself gradually. They heard it first, the distant rush of water falling from height. Then they saw the canyon opening before them, a slash in the mountain where a creek had spent millennia cutting downward through solid rock. The trail descended steeply into the canyon, and the horses picked their way carefully over loose scree and around boulders that looked ready to tumble at the slightest provocation. The sound of falling water grew louder, echoing off the stone walls until it filled the world with its roar. And then they saw it, a waterfall perhaps 40 feet high, spilling from an upper canyon into a pool so clear that Silas could see stones at the bottom, as if through glass. The water was snowmelt, cold enough to numb, and it created its own weather. Mist that rose like smoke, rainbows that flickered in the spray, a coolness that felt like stepping into another season. "Behind the waterfall," Martha said, reading from her notes of the friar's descriptions. "He wrote that there's a natural cavity in the rock, accessible if you're willing to get wet." Silas studied the falls, looking for a way to approach. The pool at the base was perhaps 20 feet across, and the falling water came down with enough force to be dangerous. But to the left side, where the water was thinner, there seemed to be space between the falls and the rock wall. A person might be able to squeeze through if they were careful.
"I'll go," he said.
"No sense both of us risking it. Silas, Martha, if something happens to me, someone needs to get back to tell the story, and to make sure whatever's here doesn't fall into the wrong hands." "That's you," she wanted to argue. He could see it in her face, but she was practical enough to recognize the sense in what he said. "Be careful. That water's cold enough to stop your heart if you're in it too long." He stripped off his coat and hat, checked that his knife was secure in its sheath, and approached the pool's edge. The water was shockingly cold when he stepped in, even through his boots. It deepened quickly, reaching his knees, then his waist. The current pulled at him, trying to drag him toward where the falls hit the pool with churning violence. He worked his way around the edge, one hand on the rock wall for balance, until he reached the thin curtain of water on the left side. Taking a deep breath, he pushed through. The world became cold and darkness, and the deafening roar of water. For a moment, disoriented and half drowned by the spray, Silas thought he'd made a terrible mistake. Then his hand found rock, not the smooth wall he'd been following, but an opening, a gap wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He pulled himself into the cavity and found himself in a space perhaps 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide. Light filtered through the waterfall, giving the space an underwater quality, green and wavering. And there, on a natural shelf of stone above the high water mark, wrapped in what looked like layers of oilcloth and waxed canvas, was a bundle. Silas's hands shook as he reached for it, partly from cold, partly from excitement. The bundle was about 2 feet long and a foot wide, carefully wrapped and tied with cord that had somehow survived more than a century of moisture and time. The outer layers were stiff with age and waterproofing, but when he carefully unwrapped them, he found layers of waxed leather protecting the contents. Inside were documents, thick parchment covered in careful script, bearing official seals and signatures. He couldn't read them in the poor light of the cave, but he could see enough to know that these were important. Formal papers, written in Latin and Spanish, heavy with the authority of church and crown. He wrapped them again carefully, tucking the bundle inside his shirt to keep it as dry as possible. Then he squeezed back through the opening behind the falls and made his way back to the pool's edge. Martha was waiting anxiously, and her face flooded with relief when she saw him emerge. "Did you find it?" "Found something," Silas said, his teeth chattering from the cold. "Documents. A lot of them. Let's get back to solid ground before we look." They retreated from the canyon, found a spot in the sun where Silas could dry off and carefully unwrap the bundle. Martha spread the documents on a flat rock, handling them with the reverence they deserved. "These are ecclesiastical papers," she said after a moment of study. "Official church documents. This one," she pointed to a thick parchment with an ornate seal. "This is a papal blessing. It grants authority to establish a mission in the Northern Territories and bestows spiritual protection on the expedition." And this, she picked up another document carefully. "This is the official record of San Felipe de Jesus's martyrdom, authenticated by multiple bishops. It establishes the provenance of the relic, proves that it's genuine. So whoever holds these documents holds the church's authority," Silas said. "In theory, yes. These papers would give any mission established in this territory a direct connection to Rome, would put it under the Pope's protection. In the 1750s, that meant power, real, tangible power. The Spanish were competing with the French and English for control of North America. A mission backed by these documents could claim vast territories in the name of the Church and Spain." Silas whistled softly. No wonder Morales wanted them. And no wonder the friar hid them. They spent the next hour examining the documents, with Martha translating the most important passages. There were letters from bishops, instructions from colonial authorities, maps showing where the new mission was to be established, and most significantly, a document signed by the Viceroy of New Spain himself, granting land rights and authority to whoever bore these papers. "This is a title," Martha said, her voice filled with awe. "A legal title to thousands of acres in what's now Colorado and New Mexico. It's probably not enforceable anymore. Too much time has passed, too many governments have changed. But in its day, this would have been worth more than gold. And that's what the friar was protecting," Silas said. "Not just the religious significance, but the political power. He knew that in the wrong hands, these documents could be used to justify all kinds of abuses." Martha nodded slowly. "Which means we need to be very careful about who we tell. Because even now, even after all this time, there are people who would kill for this kind of legitimacy. Mining companies trying to claim territory, land speculators, even governments trying to establish historical claims." They wrapped the documents again, even more carefully than before, and Silas secured them in his saddlebag. The second seal was broken now, the second part of the puzzle recovered. Only the third seal remained, the one deep in the mountains, the one containing the actual reliquary with the saint's heart. As they prepared to ride back, Silas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth near where they'd left the horses. Someone had been here while they were in the canyon, had seen their horses, had probably watched them from concealment. "We're not alone," he said quietly, pointing to the tracks. Martha saw them and paled. "How long have they been following us?" "Long enough." Silas checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded and ready. "We need to get back to the settlement. We can't risk leading them to the third marker. Not yet. They rode quickly, taking a different route back, trying to throw off pursuit. But Silas kept seeing signs, a broken branch here, displaced stone there, that suggested at least one person was trailing them at a distance. Someone skilled, someone who knew how to move through the wilderness without leaving obvious traces. It was late afternoon when they finally saw Redemption Springs in the valley below. They'd split up before reaching town, Martha riding in first with the story that they'd been surveying property lines, Silas following a half-hour later. But when Silas finally reached his homestead, he found Deputy Lockhart waiting for him, and the lawman's face was grim. "We've got trouble," Lockhart said without preamble. "Strangers rode in this morning. 6 men, heavily armed, led by a man who calls himself Cold Draven. They're asking questions about Spanish treasure, about the tree on your property, about what you found. And Silas, they're not asking politely." Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. It was starting, just as Martha had warned. The vultures had arrived, and they were hungry. "Where are they now?" he asked, "at the saloon. Drinking and talking loud about how they've been tracking Spanish treasure legends for years, how they've got maps and documents of their own. They're saying you don't have any more right to what's here than they do, and they're saying that one way or another, they're going to get their share." Silas looked at his cabin. At the homestead he'd bought for $10 and a rifle, at the widow's tree standing silent in the fading light. He'd broken the first seal, recovered the second, and in doing so he'd started something that might not be able to be stopped. "Keep them in town as long as you can," Silas told Lockhart. "Make sure they know that I respect the law, that I'm not going anywhere. I need time to think, to figure out the right way to handle this. And if they don't respect the law," Lockhart asked, "if they decide to take what they want?" Silas met the deputy's eyes. "Then they'll learn that some old mountain men still remember how to fight. But let's hope it doesn't come to that." After Lockhart left, Silas sat on his porch as darkness fell, the Spanish compass in his hand, the weight of centuries pressing down on him like the mountain itself. Fray Sebastian had known this would happen. That's why he'd made the journey so difficult, the seals so well hidden. He'd been trying to ensure that only someone worthy would complete the quest. But worthy or not, Silas had started down this path, and he couldn't see a way back that didn't involve betraying everything the friar had died to protect. So he'd have to go forward into whatever darkness waited. And he'd have to do it soon, before Cold Draven and his men forced his hand. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, he'd ride for the 3rd seal, the final marker, the place where the saint's heart waited in its stone cathedral. And whatever happened after that, well, that was in God's hands now, or fate's hands, or whatever power watched over fools who opened doors that should have stayed closed. The widow's tree rustled in the night wind, and Silas could almost hear Fray Sebastian's voice in the sound. "Examine your heart before you proceed." He'd examined it as honestly as he could, and what he'd found there wasn't pure, wasn't noble, but it was determined. He would see this through, whatever it cost. Some promises once made have to be kept, even promises made to the dead. Morning came with frost thick on the ground and Silas's breath clouding in the air. He'd slept badly, listening for sounds of approach, ready for trouble that thankfully hadn't come. But he knew it was only a matter of time before Cold Draven made his move. He was loading his saddlebags for the journey to the 3rd marker when he heard horses approaching. 3 riders coming fast from the direction of town. Silas picked up his rifle and stepped onto his porch, ready for whatever came next. But it wasn't Draven's men. It was Deputy Lockhart, accompanied by Martha and, surprisingly, Reverend Solomon Pike. They looked like a delegation bringing news he wouldn't want to hear. "Silas," Lockhart said, dismounting quickly. "We need to talk, now." They gathered in his cabin, and the tension was thick enough to cut. Martha looked worried, Pike looked troubled, and Lockhart looked like a man who'd spent the night trying to prevent a war and wasn't sure he'd succeeded. "Draven confronted me at the store this morning," Martha said without preamble. "He knows I've been helping you. He knows we rode out together yesterday, and he's threatening to—" She paused, her face flushing with anger. He said, if I don't tell him what we found, he'll burn the store. He'll destroy everything I've built. Silas felt rage flare hot in his chest. The hell he will. Lockhart, arrest him. That's extortion, threat of arson. On what evidence? Lockhart asked tiredly. He made no direct threat. He simply said it would be a shame if something happened to such a fine establishment, especially given how dry the wood is this time of year. I can't arrest a man for expressing concern about fire safety, even when we all know what he means. Then I'll handle it myself, Silas said, reaching for his gun belt. And do what? Pike's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. The Reverend had been silent until now, but when he spoke, there was steel beneath the pastoral gentleness. Kill him? Wound him? Either way, you've got 5 more men just like him, and you've proved to them that violence works. Is that the solution you want? Silas forced himself to take a breath, to think instead of react. Pike was right, much as he hated to admit it. This situation couldn't be solved with gunfire. Not yet, anyway. What do you suggest, Reverend? He asked. Pike stood and walked to the window, looking out at the widow's tree. I suggest you tell me the truth. Tell me what you found, what this is really about. Because I've spent the past day talking to people in town, listening to rumors and stories, and I think this is bigger than treasure. I think this is about something that matters to the church. Something that matters to God. Silas looked at Martha, who nodded slightly. They'd have to trust someone, and Pike was as good a choice as any, better than most, given his education and his position. So Silas told him. Everything. The chest beneath the tree, the friar's journal, the ecclesiastical documents behind the waterfall, the preserved heart of San Felipe de Jesus waiting in its mountain cathedral. He told him about Fray Sebastian's sacrifice, about Capitan Morales's betrayal, about the sacred trust that had waited in darkness for over a century. Pike listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each revelation. When Silas finished, the Reverend was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled as if in prayer. This changes everything, Pike said finally. What you found isn't treasure, it's a miracle. A genuine relic of a recognized saint, properly, authenticated by church documents, hidden here by a martyr who died to protect it. This is, he paused, searching for words, this is the kind of thing that men build cathedrals around, that pilgrims travel continents to witness, that the faithful believe can heal, can transform, can bring them closer to God. So, what do we do with it? Martha asked. We protect it, Pike said firmly. We ensure it doesn't fall into hands that would profane it or use it for worldly gain. And he looked at Silas, we need to reach the 3rd marker before Draven does, because if he gets his hands on that reliquary, he'll sell it to the highest bidder. It'll end up in some private collection or be melted down for its gold. Either way, the friar's sacrifice will have been for nothing. I'm leaving at first light tomorrow, Silas said. The 3rd marker is at least 2 days' hard ride into the mountains. I'll move fast and quiet, bring back the reliquary, and then we'll figure out what to do with it. You can't go alone, Lockhart said. If Draven's men follow you, you'll need backup. I'm coming with you. So am I, Pike added. This is church business now. I have authority here that you don't, Silas. If we recover the reliquary, I can invoke ecclesiastical protection. I can claim it in the name of the church, and that gives us legal standing that simple possession wouldn't. Silas wanted to argue, wanted to insist this was his responsibility alone. But looking at the 3 faces around him, Martha's determination, Lockhart's lawman's resolve, Pike's spiritual authority, he realized he wasn't alone in this anymore. Whether he wanted it or not, this had become larger than one man's quest. All right, he said, but Martha stays here. Someone needs to know the full story if things go wrong. And someone needs to keep an eye on Draven, Martha agreed. I'll watch him. If he moves toward the mountains, I'll find a way to warn you. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Silas showed Pike and Lockhart the maps, explained the route as best he could from the friar's descriptions. They gathered supplies for a hard journey into remote country. Warm clothes, ammunition, rope, climbing gear. Everything they'd need to reach a cave system deep in the high peaks. As they worked, Silas found himself thinking about the obsidian cross that had been in the chest beneath the widow's tree. He'd kept it, drawn to its simple beauty and the weight of history it carried. Now he pulled it out and looked at it in the afternoon light. The cross was perhaps 6 inches long, carved from volcanic glass, so black it seemed to drink light. It was smooth and cold, and when he held it, he could almost feel the friar's presence. The faith that had sustained him through torture and death, the certainty that what he protected mattered more than his own life. "That's beautiful," Pike said, noticing what Silas held. "May I?" Silas handed over the cross, and Pike examined it with reverence. Obsidian, sacred to the indigenous peoples of Mexico. The Spanish would have considered it a connection between the old beliefs and the new faith. A bridge between worlds. He looked up at Silas. "The friar carried this? It was in the chest. I've been carrying it since I found it. Seemed like it might be important." "It is," Pike said quietly. "In the old traditions, obsidian was used for spiritual protection, for cutting through darkness to reach truth. The friar chose his symbols carefully. This cross, it's not just religious jewelry. It's a key. A key to what? To understanding. To being worthy of what we seek. The friar wrote that only the faithful would recognize the way to the third marker. I suspect this cross is part of that recognition. There will be symbols, signs that only someone carrying this and understanding its significance would notice." As evening fell, they finalized their plans. They'd leave at dawn, taking a route that avoided the main trails. If Draven tried to follow, Lockhart would know. He'd arranged for some trusted settlers to watch the approaches to the high country and send word if riders passed. But as Silas was checking his gear one final time, preparing to turn in for what sleep he could get, there was a knock at his door. Hard, demanding, not friendly. He opened it to find Cole Draven standing on his porch, flanked by 2 of his men. Draven was perhaps 40, lean and weathered, with the eyes of a predator and the smile of a snake. He wore good clothes gone shabby, spoke with an educated accent that had been roughened by years on the frontier. A man who'd been something once and was trying to claw his way back to being something again. "Mr. Boone," Draven said, his voice pleasant but his eyes cold. "I thought we should talk, man to man, before things get unpleasant. I've got nothing to say to you," Silas replied, keeping his hand near his pistol. "Oh, I think you do. I think you've found something that doesn't belong to you, something that by rights should be shared with anyone who has knowledge of its existence. I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Boone. I'm not asking for all of it, just a fair share." "There's nothing to share, and even if there was, what makes you think you're entitled to any of it?" Draven's smile tightened. "Because I've spent 10 years researching Spanish treasure legends in this territory, because I've got documents of my own, maps, testimonies, historical records, because I was here first, in a sense, even if you were the one who finally broke through. Think of it as a partnership. You've got the physical location, I've got the historical knowledge. Together we could know." The word hung in the cold air between them. Draven's smile vanished, replaced by something harder, more honest. "I hoped you'd be reasonable," he said quietly. "I really did. But if you insist on being difficult, well, things have a way of getting complicated for difficult people. Accidents happen. Property gets damaged, friends get hurt. You understand what I'm saying?" Silas stepped out onto the porch, moving into Draven's space, using his size and his reputation. "I understand perfectly. You're threatening me and mine, so let me be equally clear. You come near me, near Martha Caldwell, near anyone I care about, and I'll put you in the ground. I've killed better men than you for lesser reasons. That clear enough?" Draven held his ground, but Silas saw fear flicker in his eyes. Good. The man needed to understand what he was dealing with. "You're making a mistake," Draven said, backing toward his horse. "You can't fight all of us, and you can't hide what you found. Sooner or later, one way or another, I'm going to get my share." Then I guess we'll see how that works out for you." Draven and his men rode off into the darkness, and Silas stood on his porch, his heart hammering with adrenaline he'd thought he was too old to feel. Inside, Pike and Lockhart had heard everything, their weapons ready in case the confrontation turned violent. "That settles it," Lockhart said grimly. "We leave tonight, right now, because come morning, Draven's going to have men watching every approach. If we're going to beat him to the third marker, we need to go now while we've got darkness to cover us." Pike nodded agreement. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Perhaps this confrontation was meant to happen, to push us into action before hesitation could overcome us. Silas looked at the two men who'd volunteered to share his burden. A lawman and a preacher, both armed and ready to ride into the unknown with him. It wasn't the company he'd expected when he started this journey, but it was the company he needed. "All right," he said. "We leave in an hour. Martha, you need to get back to town. Make it look like everything's normal. If anyone asks, you don't know where we've gone or when we're coming back." Martha nodded, but her face was tight with worry. "Be careful, all of you. What you're riding toward, it's not just the reliquary, it's everything that relic represents. Faith and greed, salvation and damnation, all tangled together. Don't lose sight of why you're doing this." After she left, the three men prepared in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Silas found himself holding the obsidian cross, feeling its weight, wondering if he was worthy of the trust that Fray Sebastian had placed in whoever found his markers. The friar had asked for someone pure of heart. Instead, he'd gotten a tired mountain man with blood on his hands and doubts in his soul. But maybe that was enough. Maybe being willing to try to put yourself at risk for something larger than yourself was what purity looked like in a fallen world. They rode out into the darkness, three men on a mission that had been waiting 126 years to be completed. Behind them, the settlement slept, unaware that its future was being decided in the high country. And somewhere in that same darkness, Cold Draven watched and planned, determined to claim what he believed was rightfully his. The mountains stood silent, keeping their secrets for a while longer. But not much longer. The time for revelation was coming, whether men were ready for it or not. They rode through the night, using the stars and Silas's knowledge of the terrain to navigate in darkness. The horses picked their way carefully over rocky ground, and the men spoke little, conserving their energy for the journey ahead. By dawn, they were high in the mountains, well beyond any trails that casual travelers would follow. The third marker, according to Fray Sebastian's maps, was in a remote area that even the indigenous peoples had avoided. The friar had written about it with a mixture of awe and fear, a place where the mountain seemed to have been split open by some ancient force, creating passages that led deep into the earth. He'd stumbled upon it while fleeing from an attack, had seen it as divine providence that he'd been led to a place so remote, so naturally protected. As the sun climbed higher, Silas consulted the maps and the friar's descriptions repeatedly. They were looking for a series of landmarks, a creek that split around a boulder shaped like an altar, a stand of 3 pines struck by lightning but still living, and finally a rock face marked with petroglyphs that predated even the Ute presence in these mountains. "There," Pike said suddenly, pointing ahead. "Those pines. 3 of them, scarred by fire but still alive. That has to be what the friar described." They approached the trees and found that Pike was right. The pines were ancient, their trunks blackened by lightning strikes that should have killed them, but somehow hadn't. They stood like sentinels, marking the boundary between the world of men and something older, something that existed beyond human understanding. Beyond the pines, the land rose sharply. They had to dismount and lead the horses up a narrow defile between massive rock formations. The passage was barely wide enough for a horse, and the walls rose so high that the sun reached them for only a few hours each day. It was cold here, permanently shadowed, and Silas felt the weight of the mountain pressing down like physical force. Then they emerged into a small valley, barely an acre across, surrounded by cliffs that rose hundreds of feet on all sides. And there, on the far wall, were the petroglyphs, ancient symbols carved into the rock face by hands that had turned to dust long before the Spanish ever set foot in the New World. "Good Lord," Lockhart breathed.
This place.
"It feels like we've stepped out of time itself." Silas felt it too. There was something about this valley, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was powerful. The kind of place that demanded respect, that reminded humans how small they were in the face of geological time. They secured the horses and approached the rock face on foot. The petroglyphs were weathered, but still visible. Spirals and handprints, figures that might have been human or might have been gods, symbols whose meanings had been lost to time. But among them, visible only to someone who knew what to look for, were other marks. Fresher marks, carved perhaps 130 years ago. Small crosses, 14 of them, arranged in a pattern that Silas didn't initially recognize. But Pike did. "The Stations of the Cross," the Reverend said, his voice hushed with reverence. 14 stations marking Christ's journey to crucifixion. The friar said that only the faithful would recognize the way. This is it. This is the path we're meant to follow. The crosses were carved at irregular intervals across the rock face, some high, some low, each marked with Roman numerals. They started at the base of the cliff and led upward, disappearing into a crack in the rock that Silas hadn't noticed at first glance. "He wants us to climb," Lockhart said, studying the route. Using the stations as handholds and footholds, they roped themselves together and began the ascent, following the path that Fray Sebastian had carved into stone. It was treacherous work. The holds were small, weathered by more than a century of freeze and thaw, and one wrong move could send them all tumbling to the valley floor below. But slowly, carefully they climbed. And as they climbed, Silas found himself thinking about the friar, wounded and dying, making this same ascent while bleeding from Morales' torture. The man's determination must have been superhuman, driven by faith so strong it overcame mere physical limitation. The crack in the rock widened as they climbed, becoming a chimney that led into the mountain itself. At the top, perhaps 60 feet above the valley floor, they found themselves at the entrance to a cave system. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways, but beyond it, darkness beckoned. They lit their lanterns and entered single file. The passage was tight at first, forcing them to move slowly, but gradually it opened into larger chambers. The rock here was different from the outside. Limestone rather than granite, carved by water over millennia into fantastic shapes. Formations hung from the ceiling like chandeliers, and columns rose from the floor where stalactites and stalagmites had joined over countless years. "It's beautiful," Pike whispered, his lantern throwing wild shadows across the cave walls. "Like a cathedral carved by God's own hand." They followed the natural passages deeper into the mountain, and Silas found himself watching for more of the friar's markers. They appeared regularly, small crosses carved into the rock, arrows scratched into stone, occasionally a word or phrase in Latin that Pike translated as prayers or verses from Scripture. The friar had been thorough, had created a path that could be followed by anyone with faith and determination. But he'd also made sure it couldn't be followed casually. The markers were subtle, easily missed by someone who wasn't looking for them. And the passages branched repeatedly, creating a maze that would trap the unwary. They'd been underground for perhaps 2 hours when they reached a chamber that stopped all 3 of them in their tracks. It was vast, easily 100 feet across and 60 feet high, and it was exactly as the friar had described, a natural cathedral carved by water and time into the shape of something holy. Formations created what looked like pillars supporting a vaulted ceiling. A natural basin in the floor held clear water that reflected their lantern light like liquid starlight. And at the far end, on a raised platform of stone that resembled nothing so much as an altar, something gleamed in the darkness. They approached slowly, reverently, each man feeling the weight of the moment. This was what they'd come for. This was what Fray Sebastian had died to protect. This was the secret that had waited in darkness for 126 years. The reliquary was smaller than Silas had expected, perhaps a foot tall and 8 inches across, but it was exquisite. gold worked with a master's skill, set with crystals that caught and threw back their lantern light. The base was inscribed with Latin that Pike read aloud in a hushed voice. Here lies the heart of San Felipe de Jesus, first martyr of Mexico, who gave his life for the faith in Japan in the year of our Lord 1597. May his sacrifice inspire all who seek the face of God. Through the crystal panels of the reliquary, they could see what appeared to be preserved tissue, brown and ancient, but miraculously intact. The saint's heart, kept safe by faith and stone for more than 200 years. But it was what surrounded the reliquary that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. Arranged in a careful circle around the altar were bones, human bones, a complete skeleton, laid out with hands folded across the chest, the skull facing the reliquary in eternal vigil. Fray Sebastian, Pike said quietly. He wasn't just buried here. He chose to stay, to keep watch over what he'd protected. Silas knelt beside the bones, feeling a connection across the centuries to this man who'd sacrificed everything for his beliefs. The friar had crawled here after Morales's torture, had sealed himself into this chamber, had died slowly in the darkness rather than reveal what he protected. But something was wrong. Silas's scout's instincts, honed by decades of survival, were screaming that something wasn't right. He looked around the chamber, studying the details, and gradually realized what bothered him. The bones weren't old enough. He'd seen enough death in his life to know what a century of decay looked like. These bones, while certainly not fresh, weren't ancient. They were relatively recent, maybe a few decades old at most, and the positioning was too deliberate, too carefully arranged. "Pike," he said slowly, "look at these bones again. Really look at them." The Reverend knelt beside him, and Silas watched, understanding dawn on his face. "These aren't—" "No," Silas confirmed. "These aren't Fray Sebastian's remains. Someone else put these here. Recently, within the last 20, 30 years maybe." Lockhart joined them, his lawman's eye studying the scene. "A fake, but why? Who would go to this kind of trouble?" Silas pulled out the obsidian cross he'd been carrying and held it up to catch the lantern light. For the first time, he noticed something he'd missed before. A tiny inscription on the back of the cross, so small it was almost invisible. Spanish words that Pike translated. "The true guardian watches from above, where betrayer and betrayed both rest in stone. Seek where the mountains split and the tree grows from death." "It's a riddle," Pike said. "The friar left us a riddle. This isn't the real chamber. This is what? A test, a decoy?" Silas stood, his mind racing. The friar had been clever, more clever than they'd given him credit for. He'd created this elaborate chamber, this perfect cathedral space, knowing that anyone who found it would assume they'd reached the end of their journey. But the real relic, the actual heart of San Felipe, was somewhere else. "Where betrayer and betrayed both rest in stone," Silas repeated. "Morales and the friar. He's saying they're buried together. But how is that possible? Morales died somewhere in the mountains, and the friar—" "Unless they didn't," Lockhart said slowly. "Unless the friar's final journal entries were lies, or partial truths. What if Morales didn't leave him to die? What if something else happened?" Pike was flipping through his notes, the translations of the journal entries they'd made. "Here, listen to this entry, one of the very last ones. Morales has returned, and in his madness he has done what I could not. He has brought us both to the true resting place, the place where the mountain itself will be our tomb. He seeks the relic still, does not understand that he has already found it, that he stands upon it even as he demands I reveal its location. In his rage he has sealed us both in stone, and here we will remain until the worthy come to set us free." He's not talking about this cave, Silas realized. He's talking about somewhere else. Somewhere that Morales took him. Somewhere they both died buried together. "The widow's tree," Pike said suddenly. "Think about it. You broke open the stone and found the chest, but you didn't explore the cavity fully. You got the chest and covered it back up. What if there's more down there? What if the friar's body, his real body, is still in that cavity, along with Morales's?" Silas felt his stomach drop. They'd come all this way, followed the maps and the markers, descended into the mountain itself, only to discover that what they sought had been under the widow's tree all along. The place where it had started, the first seal, which wasn't really first at all, it was last. The final resting place of both men, betrayer and betrayed, guardian and thief. But then what's this? Lockhart asked, gesturing to the elaborate chamber, the fake reliquary, the carefully arranged bones. Why create all of this if it's not real? Because the friar knew someone like Morales would come again, Pike said. Someone greedy, someone who would follow maps and markers without understanding their true meaning. He created a perfect decoy. Anyone who found this place would think they'd succeeded, would take this reliquary and leave, never knowing they had a fake. The real relic would remain safe, hidden in the one place no one would think to look again. The place already searched, already discovered, already dismissed. Silas sat heavily on the stone floor, the weight of revelation pressing down on him. The friar had been brilliant. He'd created a treasure hunt that tested not just determination but wisdom. The faithful, the worthy, would understand that the journey was circular, that the end was in the beginning, that the greatest truths were often hidden in plain sight. But that meant they had to go back. Back through the mountains, back to the settlement, back to the widow's tree, and back to where Cold Draven was undoubtedly waiting, having figured out by now that they'd left town. "We've been played," Lockhart said, but there was admiration in his voice rather than anger. That old friar, dying and tortured, still had the presence of mind to create a trap that would work a century later. He knew human nature, knew that greed would make men follow the obvious path while the truth waited where they'd already been. Silas picked up the fake reliquary, examining it more closely. It was beautifully made, but now that he knew what to look for, he could see the differences. The gold was too bright, too new. The crystals were glass rather than genuine gems, and the preserved heart inside was probably nothing more than treated leather, shaped to look authentic in dim light. "Someone made this," he said. "Made it recently and placed it here. But who and why? Maybe that's a mystery for another day," Pike suggested. "Right now, we need to get back to your homestead before Draven and his men figure out what we have. Because if they realize this is fake, they'll know what we know, that the real relic is still at the tree." They began the journey back through the cave system, moving as quickly as caution allowed. But Silas's mind was churning with questions. The friar's plan made sense. Create a decoy to protect the real relic. But someone had executed that plan long after the friar's death. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to craft the fake reliquary and place it here, along with bones that would make the scene convincing. Who, and more importantly, why? Had someone else discovered the friar's story decades ago and decided to help complete his mission? Or was there something else going on, something he didn't yet understand? They emerged from the cave as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of red and gold. The climb down was treacherous in the fading light, but they managed it without incident. Their horses were where they'd left them, grazing peacefully in the small valley. "We ride through the night," Silas said, already cinching his saddle. "If we're lucky, we can reach my homestead by dawn. Martha needs to know what we've discovered, and we need to excavate beneath the tree properly before Draven forces the issue." They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits, but not beyond them. Silas kept checking their back trail, watching for signs of pursuit. The mountains were quiet, but that didn't mean they were alone. Draven had proven himself skilled and determined. He could be anywhere, watching and waiting. As they descended from the high country into more familiar territory, Silas found himself thinking about Fray Sebastian's final choices. The man had been tortured, had watched his companions murdered, had known he was dying. Yet he'd still had the clarity of mind to plan for centuries ahead, to create a system that would protect what he valued most. That took a special kind of strength, a special kind of faith, and it made Silas wonder about his own beliefs, his own values. What would he be willing to die for? What truths would he protect with his last breath? The questions haunted him as they rode through the darkness, the mountains standing silent witness to their passing. And somewhere ahead, beneath a twisted tree growing from stone, two men lay in eternal rest, guarding a secret that had waited 126 years to be revealed. The real journey, Silas realized, was only just beginning. They reached the outskirts of Redemption Springs, just as the eastern sky began to gray with approaching dawn. Exhausted, cold, and hungry, they nevertheless maintained their vigilance as they approached Silas's homestead. Something felt wrong. The air had that quality of tension that Silas had learned to recognize during his scouting days, the feeling that violence had recently occurred or was about to. As they crested the final ridge that overlooked his property, they saw why. 6 horses were tied outside his cabin, and smoke rose from his chimney. Draven had made himself at home. That son of a... Lockhart began, his hand moving to his pistol. "Easy," Silas cautioned. "We don't know the situation yet. Could be Martha's in there. Could be they've got hostages." They approached carefully, leaving their horses tied in a copse of trees a quarter-mile from the cabin. Silas led them through terrain he knew intimately, using the pre-dawn darkness to get close without being spotted. They belly-crawled the last 100 yards, finding positions behind his woodpile and tool shed that gave them clear views of the cabin's front and side. Through the window, Silas could see movement inside. Draven and his men had indeed taken over. They were eating his food, drinking his coffee, laughing and talking as if they owned the place. But he saw no sign of Martha or anyone else being held against their will. That was something, at least. "What's the play?" Lockhart whispered. "I can deputize you two right now if needed. That makes this an official law enforcement action." "Hold on that," Silas said. "Let me try something first." He stood up slowly, making sure he was visible in the growing light, and walked toward his cabin with his rifle held casually but ready. Behind him, Pike and Lockhart stayed hidden, but positioned to provide covering fire if needed. The door opened before Silas reached it, and Draven stepped out, smiling that snake smile of his. But Silas noticed that 4 of Draven's men had taken positions at the windows, guns ready. This wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "Mr. Boone," Draven said pleasantly, "welcome home. I hope you don't mind I let myself in. You were gone so long and your cabin was just sitting here empty. Seemed a shame to waste it." "Get out," Silas said flatly. "You and your men, now." "Oh, I don't think so. You see, I've been doing some thinking while you were off on your little expedition. And I've come to a conclusion. You don't actually have any claim to what's on this property." "Not really. This land was Mexican territory when the Spanish came through. Then it was part of the United States land purchases. Property lines from those days are fuzzy at best. I'd argue that anything of historical significance found here belongs to whoever can prove historical knowledge of it. And I've got documents, maps, and journals of my own that prove I've been researching this treasure for a decade." "What have you got?" "A homestead deed you bought for $10. Silas felt anger building but kept his voice level. "I've got possession. I've got discovery. And I've got the law on my side. Deputy Lockhart, would you care to explain property rights to Mr. Draven?" Lockhart stepped out from behind the woodpile, his badge catching the morning light. "Cole Draven, you're trespassing on private property. You've got about 10 seconds to vacate, or I'm placing you under arrest." Draven's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Deputy, I wondered if you'd show up. Here's the thing. You're one man with a badge. I've got 6 men with guns. Do the math. Besides, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to negotiate. To work out a fair arrangement that benefits everyone." "There's nothing to negotiate," Silas said. "Whatever was here, whatever I found, it's not treasure. It's sacred. It belongs to the church, and Reverend Pike is the church's representative. So unless you've got ecclesiastical authority I don't know about, you've got no claim at all." Pike emerged from cover, his presence adding weight to Silas's words. In his hands, he carried the documents they'd recovered from behind the waterfall. The papal blessings, the official records, the proof of the relic's authenticity. "These documents," Pike said, holding them up, "establish that what we're dealing with is a holy relic, properly documented and authenticated by the Catholic Church. Under both Spanish colonial law and current United States law, such items are protected. They cannot be bought, sold, or claimed by private individuals. Mr. Draven, whatever you think you're entitled to, you're wrong. This matter is now under church jurisdiction." Draven's expression shifted. For the first time, Silas saw uncertainty flicker across his face. The man was smart enough to understand that he was in over his head, but too greedy to back down. "Church jurisdiction," Draven repeated. "That's convenient. But I notice you didn't actually find anything in the mountains, did you?" "Oh, I've been watching. I had men trailing you the whole way. They reported back this morning. You went into that cave system, stayed for a few hours, and came back empty-handed. So whatever's there, you didn't recover it. Which means it's still up for grabs." Silas and Pike exchanged glances. Draven had been more thorough than they'd expected, but he'd also revealed his hand. He didn't know about the fake reliquary, didn't understand the friar's true plan. He was still thinking the prize was in the mountains. "You're right," Silas said carefully. "We didn't find what we were looking for in the cave. Turns out the friar's maps weren't as accurate as we thought. But that doesn't give you any right to be here, on my property, eating my food and threatening my friends." "Threatening?" Draven laughed. "I haven't threatened anyone. I'm simply, camping. Taking advantage of an empty cabin while its owner was away. No harm done." "Then you won't mind leaving now that the owner's back," Lockhart said, his hand resting on his pistol grip. The standoff could have gone either way. Silas could feel the tension building, could see Draven's men shifting nervously, unsure whether their employer was going to push this into violence. But before anyone could make a move, a new voice cut through the morning air. "Gentlemen, I think that's quite enough." They all turned to see Martha Caldwell riding up the trail, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came a dozen men from the settlement, farmers, storekeepers, miners, all armed and looking determined. And in the lead, riding a large grey horse with authority, was a man Silas didn't recognize. He was perhaps 60, well-dressed despite the trail dust, and carried himself with the bearing of someone used to command. "Who the hell are you?" Draven demanded. The stranger dismounted smoothly and pulled a leather wallet from his coat, flipping it open to reveal official-looking credentials. "Bishop Marcus Sandoval, sent from Santa Fe to investigate reports of a significant religious discovery in this territory. Miss Caldwell sent word 3 days ago, and I came as quickly as I could." Silas blinked in surprise. Martha had contacted the church without telling him? He looked at her, and she gave a slight shrug as if to say, "You're welcome." Bishop Sandoval surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. The armed men, the obvious tension, the documents in Pike's hands. "I see I arrived just in time. Now then, which of you is Silas Boone?" "That would be me, Your Excellency," Silas said, not entirely sure if that was the right form of address, but figuring respectful couldn't hurt. "And you're the one who discovered the chest beneath the tree? The one who's been following Fray Sebastian de Cordoba's markers?" "Yes, sir." The bishop nodded slowly. "Then we have much to discuss. But first," he turned to Draven, "you and your men will leave this property immediately. I have the authority of the Catholic Church behind me, and I can promise you that if you interfere with church business, you'll find yourself facing more than just local law enforcement. The church has long reach and very long memory. Are we clear?" Draven looked like he wanted to argue, but facing a bishop backed by a dozen armed settlers was too much even for his bravado. "This isn't over," he said to Silas. "Whatever you found, whatever you think you've got, I'll find a way to get my share." "The only thing you'll get," the bishop said coldly, "is arrested for interfering with religious property if I see you near this location again. Now go." Draven and his men mounted up and rode out, but Silas could see the calculation in Draven's eyes. The man wasn't giving up, he was just changing tactics. They'd need to move fast now, before Draven figured out some new approach. After they'd gone, the bishop turned to address the assembled group. "Miss Caldwell has briefed me on what you've discovered. The documents, the journal entries, the locations of the markers. Quite remarkable, really. Fray Sebastian was a hero of the church, though his sacrifice has been largely forgotten by history. What you've done, recovering his work, honoring his memory, this is important. "Your Excellency," Pike said respectfully, "there's something you need to know about what we found. Or rather, what we didn't find." They explained about the cave, the fake reliquary, the riddle that led back to the widow's tree. The bishop listened intently, his expression growing more thoughtful with each revelation. "Clever man, that friar," he said finally. He understood that true faith requires wisdom as much as devotion. He created a test that would separate the seekers of truth from the seekers of treasure. "And you've passed his test by understanding it. Now comes the hard part, recovering what he protected." "The cavity beneath the tree," Silas said. "When I broke the stone open, I pulled out the chest and covered everything back up. I didn't explore deeper, but according to the friar's final riddle, his body is down there, and Morales' body, and the real reliquary. Then we excavate," the bishop said simply, "carefully and properly with respect for the dead and reverence for the sacred. And we do it now, before Mr. Draven decides to return with reinforcements or legal challenges." The men from town set to work immediately, bringing proper tools and lumber to shore up the excavation. Silas directed them based on his knowledge of the site, and they carefully removed the boards he'd placed over the gap in the stone. The cavity was deeper than he'd first realized. The chest had been sitting on a natural ledge, perhaps 3 feet down, but below that the space continued into darkness. They rigged ropes and lanterns, and Silas, being the smallest of the men and the most experienced at close-quarters work, volunteered to go down. Lowered by rope, with a lantern tied to his belt, Silas descended into the space beneath the widow's tree. The walls were carved stone, clearly worked by human hands, not natural formation. About 6 feet down, the narrow shaft opened into a small chamber, perhaps 8 feet across. And there, arranged with deliberate care, were 2 skeletons. They lay side by side, one with hands folded in prayer, the other with arms sprawled in death's final gesture. Between them, on a flat stone that served as a table, sat a reliquary. This one was nothing like the fake they'd found in the cave. It was simpler, older, made of silver that had tarnished black with age. But through its crystal panel, Silas could see something that made his breath catch. Tissue that still held color, that seemed almost alive despite centuries of burial. "I found them," he called up. "The Friar Morales and the reliquary, just as the riddle said." Carefully, reverently, they brought everything up. The bishop insisted on being the one to handle the reliquary, and as he lifted it into the morning sunlight, something extraordinary happened. The crystal panel caught the light and seemed to glow from within, casting rainbow patterns across the weathered stone of the widow's tree. "San Felipe de Jesus," the bishop breathed, making the sign of the cross. "After all these years, after all these centuries, you've come home." They laid the skeletons out on blankets, treating them with the dignity they deserved. The bishop identified which was the friar. His bones showed evidence of the torture Morales had inflicted, and around his neck was a small copper cross, the kind Franciscan friars wore. Morales's remains were more difficult to identify, but a rusted pistol and the remnants of a military jacket provided clues. "They died together," Pike observed. "After everything, the betrayal, the violence, the torture, they still ended up side by side in death. Perhaps that was the friar's final act of forgiveness," the bishop suggested, "to ensure that even his enemy would rest in sacred ground. That's the kind of faith we need more of in this world." As the morning progressed, more details emerged. The chamber beneath the tree had been carefully prepared, the friar's final resting place, created with his last strength. He'd arranged everything precisely, the bodies, the reliquary, even a sealed scroll that they found tucked into a niche in the wall. The bishop opened the scroll carefully, and Pike translated the Latin inscription. "Here lie Fray Sebastián de Córdoba and Capitán Diego Morales, both servants of God, though one in life and the other at death. May their souls find peace in the Lord's embrace, and may those who find them understand that all men are equal before God's judgment. The treasure you sought lies not in gold or glory, but in the understanding that faith requires sacrifice and love requires forgiveness. Guard well what is entrusted to you, for it is holy beyond measure." Silas found himself moved in a way he hadn't expected. The friar had forgiven his torturer, had ensured that Morales would be buried with honor despite everything. That kind of grace seemed almost impossible, yet here was the evidence. Two men who'd been enemies in life, resting peacefully together in death. The settlers stood in respectful silence as the bishop blessed the remains and the reliquary. It felt like the end of something, the completion of a story that had been waiting over a century to be finished. But Silas knew it was also a beginning. What they did with this discovery would determine whether Fray Sebastian's sacrifice had meaning. "Your Excellency," he said quietly, "what happens now? With the reliquary with the friar's remains?" The bishop considered carefully before answering. "The reliquary will return to the church where it belongs. It will be properly housed, properly venerated, available to the faithful who seek its blessing. As for Fray Sebastian," he looked at the widow's tree, at the stone it grew from, at the land that had kept this secret for so long. "I think he should rest here. This is where he chose to make his stand, where he gave his life for what he believed. This is sacred ground now, sanctified by his sacrifice. We'll give him a proper burial, with all the honors due a martyr. And this place will be marked, remembered, honored." "And Morales?" Martha asked. "Him too." The friar's final lesson, that forgiveness matters more than revenge, that mercy matters more than justice. We bury them together, just as the friar intended. As the men began preparing for a proper interment, Silas walked to the widow's tree and placed his hand on its ancient bark. The tree that had been called cursed, that had frightened generations with stories of misfortune, was actually a monument. A living gravestone marking the resting place of a hero. "Thank you," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to the tree, the friar's spirit, or just the mountain itself. "Thank you for keeping the secret safe. Thank you for waiting until the right time." The tree rustled in the morning breeze, and Silas could almost hear Fray Sebastian's voice in the sound. "Examine your heart before you proceed." He had examined it, had found it wanting in many ways, but also found that it was willing to seek truth, willing to honor sacrifice, willing to complete a mission that had been waiting over a century for someone to fulfill it. He'd opened a door that was meant to stay closed. But in doing so, he'd brought light into darkness, had revealed a story that deserved to be told, had ensured that a good man's sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. Whatever came next, whatever challenges still waited, Silas knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes, curiosity wasn't a curse. It was the key to redemption.